Attention, attention, this is History Lost in Time. And welcome to episode 45 of the History Lost in Time podcast. This podcast is available in German and English on YouTube, Spotify and Podcast.de, with social media presences on Blue Sky and Instagram. The topic of this episode. In this episode, I will talk about the third Chancellor of the Weimar Republic, Hermann Müller of the Social Democratic SPD. What's special about him is that he served as Chancellor twice. Once for a short time in the spring of 1920 and again from 1928 to 1930. As Foreign Minister, he signed the Treaty of Versailles, and as Chancellor, he witnessed the beginning of the Great Depression. His second chancellorship was also the last normal chancellorship of the Weimar Republic and the last with a parliamentary majority. Today, however, like many other chancellors of the German Empire and the Weimar Republic, he is virtually forgotten, but more on that at the end. Political agenda and background. None. My interest in the Weimar Republic is more of a personal one. Sometimes it seems to me as if this republic is equated these days with the failure of democracy and the harbinger of Hitler. But the Weimar Republic was much more than that, and I would like to do my small part to make that a little more widely known. The sources that were used. Hans Mommsen, Aufstieg und Untergang der Republik von Weimar 1918 bis 33. Translation, Rise and Fall of the Republic of Weimar. Published by Ullstein Propyläen, Berlin 1998. Bernd Braun, die Reichskanzler der Weimarer Republik. Translation, The Reich Chancellors of the Weimar Republic. Published by Verlag Kohlhammer, Stuttgart 2013. Hermann Müller was born on May 18, 1876 in Mannheim as the eldest of Georg Müller's 4 children. Georg Müller was the director of a sparkling wine factory and a cosmopolitan and left-wing liberal man. Hermann Müller later said of his father that he blended the old ideas of southern German democracy with Bismarck worship. As a child, Hermann Müller lacked nothing and was able to attend the gymnasium. In 1888, the family moved to Radebeul near Dresden, where Georg Müller took over the management of another sparkling wine factory. However, Georg Müller died unexpectedly in 1892. This caused a dramatic social decline for the family. Hermann Müller was forced to abandon his school career. In October 1892, he began a commercial apprenticeship at Villeroy und Boch in Frankfurt am Main. Villeroy and Boch began producing bathroom and toilet sets at the end of the 19th century. This fact was later used by the right-wing parties to denigrate Hermann Müller as a toilet bowl salesman. In 1893, at the age of 17, Müller joined the SPD, the Social Democratic Party of Germany. The reasons for this likely lie in his personal experience of social decline following the death of his father and the loss of his originally planned educational path. In 1899, Müller changed careers. He took over the management of the SPD newspaper Görlitzer Volkszeitung and became a full-time party official. In 1902, he married Elfriede Tockus, a Jewish woman from Silesia. Their daughter Anna Maria was born in October 1905. Just 5 weeks later, Elfriede Tockus died of tuberculosis. Hermann Müller married Gottliebe Jäger, a Silesian woman, in 1909. His second daughter Erika was born in 1910. Both daughters later chose unusual, male-dominated courses of study. Anna Maria, who called herself Annemarie, became a dentist, while Erika studied law. From 1903 to 1906, Müller served as a city councillor in Görlitz. There he caught the eye of SPD veteran August Bebel, who then brought Müller into national politics. In his first attempt in 1905, he missed a spot on the SPD party executive committee in a runoff vote against the future SPD leader and Reich President Friedrich Ebert. But in 1906, Müller finally succeeded. Incidentally, the runoff vote didn't prevent Müller and Ebert from becoming good friends. Together, they focused on modernizing and professionalizing the SPD in the period before the First World War. Müller belonged to the centrist, practice-oriented party wing. Within the SPD, he was considered a kind of unofficial foreign representative because he spoke French well. He was therefore often used as a liaison with the French socialists. At the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, Hermann Müller supported the Burgfrieden. This was an agreement between all parties represented in the Reichstag to prevent partisan strife during the war. It wasn't until 1916, in a by-election, that Müller was able to become a member of the Reichstag. In 1917, he participated in a socialist conference in Stockholm, which aimed to initiate a peace process. However, this was unsuccessful. During the war, Müller opposed annexations. However, in the spring of 1918, he supported the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Soviet Russia, which led to massive border shifts in Eastern Europe. In the fall of 1918, he supported the SPD's entry into the last government of the empire under Prince Max von Baden. During the 1918–1919 revolution, Müller served, among other roles, as deputy chairman of the Workers' and Soldiers' Councils of Germany. In this role, he advocated for the introduction of parliamentary democracy in Germany rather than the Soviet path of a Soviet republic. On June 14, 1919, he and Otto Wels replaced the previous SPD leadership duo of Ebert and Scheidemann and became SPD party chairman. At that time, Friedrich Ebert was Reich President and Philipp Scheidemann was Reich Minister President, meaning the head of government. Just 7 days later, however, the Scheidemann government was history. The first Reich Minister President had positioned himself too strongly and could not reconcile his personal credibility with signing the Treaty of Versailles. More on this in episode 37. Given the harsh military realities, Germany had no choice but to sign the treaty. Hermann Müller was considered as the new Reich Chancellor at the time, but he declined the position, considering the situation hopeless. The new SPD government leader, Gustav Bauer, then appointed Hermann Müller as his foreign minister on June 21, 1919. Bernd Braun expresses it best in his book on the Reich Chancellors on page 59, so I'll quote him directly. Müller had to take on the most thankless task ever assigned to a head of the Foreign Office in German history. On June 28, Müller, together with Reich Colonial Minister Johannes Bell, signed the peace treaty between Germany and the victorious powers of the First World War at the Palace of Versailles. The fact that he had signed the treaty made Hermann Müller a traitor to his country in the eyes of the right-wingers in Germany. He himself considered the treaty intolerable, but also saw no alternative to accepting it. In the following years, he campaigned for a peaceful revision of the treaty. Hermann Müller remained foreign minister under Gustav Bauer until the spring of 1920. When the Bauer government fell after the failed Kapp Putsch in March 1920, Hermann Müller took over the government at the age of just 43. However, it was clear that this was only a transitional government, as elections for the Reichstag were scheduled for early June 1920. In his government declaration of March 29, 1920, Hermann Müller addressed more general goals, as found on page 83 of the Braun book. The most important duty of the newly formed Reich government will be to integrate democracy, which has proven itself to be the strongest force in Germany in the struggle against reactionary putsch and military dictatorship, even more deeply into the public institutions of the Republic and to consolidate it until the elections. Anyone who has made common cause with Kapp and his comrades, whether in the authorities or in the Reichswehr, must disappear. They must be swept out with an iron broom. Those who have been eliminated must be replaced by men who are serious about serving democracy and the Republic. But that remained theory. During the Kapp Putsch, a militant left-wing counter-movement had formed in the Ruhr region, which quickly assembled a 50,000-strong Red Army. This army now wanted to continue the revolution and end it according to the Soviet model. This left-wing rebellion could only be crushed with the help of the Reichswehr and Freikorps units, which Müller had just criticized, and which had just staged a coup against the government. This led to the simultaneously cruel and bizarre situation in which units that had just wanted to overthrow the Republic were now marching out to defend it. But as much as the right-wing radical Freikorps units rejected the Republic, they would rather live in a democratic republic than be hanged in a Soviet People's Republic. The elections in early June 1920 were a disaster for the governing parties, the SPD, the Centre Party and the DDP. The SPD, the Chancellor's party, plummeted from just under 38% to just under 22%. The bourgeois Catholic Centre Party managed to maintain its results somewhat, falling only from just under 20% to 18%. The left-wing liberal DDP, on the other hand, plummeted from 18.5 to just 8.3. While the three parties had previously held a majority in the Reichstag with 76.1%, they were now in the minority with only 48.2%. The big winners were the radical left-wing USPD, the right-wing conservative DNVP, and the right-wing liberal DVP. A grand coalition that would have included the DVP was not possible, however, so the SPD, still the strongest party, went into opposition. From then on, President Friedrich Ebert was forced to govern with bourgeois chancellors and minority cabinets. Hermann Müller had performed well as foreign minister and chancellor, which is why he retained his leading role in the SPD. He had proven that he could take on thankless tasks, and he knew the party apparatus well. By 1928, he had become the SPD's leading parliamentarian in the Reichstag, even though he wasn't a particularly good speaker or particularly charismatic. However, he was very popular due to his conciliatory attitude. As party and parliamentary group leader, he repeatedly advocated for the occasional support of bourgeois minority cabinets when it was in the interests of democracy and the Republic. One of his greatest challenges during this period was to forge one party out of the SPD and USPD, which had been merged again in 1922, to bridge old divides and achieve peace within the party. Integration skills and sensitivity were required here, and Hermann Müller mastered this task admirably. The Reich Chancellor's book states on page 120, Hermann Müller mastered both tasks, balancing the different wings within the SPD and balancing the interests of the state and the party, because he never went too far in conflicts and was therefore able to maintain dialogue with his opponents. Negative comments claim he was too conciliatory. Positive ones, such as that of his parliamentary colleague Toni Pfülf, claim he was a good comrade. In the 1928 elections, the SPD emerged as the resounding winner. With almost 30%, it was by far the strongest party, gaining the most votes. The right-wing conservative DNVP suffered heavy losses and was the clear loser of the election. The bourgeois Catholic Centre Party remained the second strongest force. Together with the Centre Party's Bavarian sister party, the Bavarian People's Party BVP, and the two liberal parties, the DDP and the DVP, they theoretically formed a parliamentary majority in the Reichstag, the first since 1920. Forming a government, however, proved difficult. Hermann Müller, now 52 years old, was the SPD's clear candidate for Chancellor. The alternative, Otto Braun, the longtime SPD Prime Minister of Prussia, had little support within the Reich SPD. But the idea of an SPD Chancellorship met with little interest from Reich President von Hindenburg. Mommsen's book states on page 306, due to the election results, the only conceivable majority formation was a grand coalition government. Reich President von Hindenburg hesitated to appoint a social democrat as chancellor. However, he was persuaded by Count Westarp that it would be tactically more advantageous to let the SPD wear itself out in government work. Hermann Müller, the SPD chairman tasked with forming the government, whose conciliatory nature and ability to compromise were recognized far beyond his own party, ultimately developed a positive relationship with Hindenburg. Hindenburg later described Müller as the best chancellor as he could have had, but who unfortunately was a social democrat. President Hindenburg exerted strong influence on the formation of the government. He pushed through his own candidate, former General Groener, as Reich Defense Minister, and rejected several of Müller's ministerial candidates. Within the Centre Party and the German People's Party DVP, there were strong reservations about a coalition with the SPD. In the end, it was the seriously ill DVP leader and Foreign Minister Gustav Stresemann who proposed the formation of a cabinet of personalities. This cabinet was appointed, initially without a formal coalition, and began its work. The Reich Chancellor's book states on page 103, "The fact that this cabinet, built on shaky foundations, ultimately became the longest-serving cabinet of the Weimar Republic, was due in no small part to the leadership of Hermann Müller, who was focused on balance and compromise." On the same page, a portion of Hermann Müller's second government declaration is quoted. The election campaign has proven to the world that after the difficult post-war years, the German people have entered a period of calm and steady development. The foundations of the new state, the German Republic, stand firm and unshakable. The Reich government has the task of building further on the now firmly established foundation and working tirelessly to ensure that the wounds of the war and the post-war period are increasingly healed and that determined reform work is carried out in all areas. For only resolute continuation along the path of social and political progress corresponds to the will expressed by the German people in the Reichstag elections. From today's perspective, this may sound somewhat naive. After all, the Weimar Republic collapsed just a few years later. However, by the end of the 1920s, Germany had indeed entered a relatively stable phase. The so-called Golden Twenties brought about a period of economic recovery and revitalization in Germany. Parties from the SPD to the DNVP had participated in the government in various constellations. There had been non-violent transfers of power. The difficult and turbulent early years had been overcome. The Communist Party was weak, and the Nazi Party was still of no significance at all. The last points in this list in particular were to change during Hermann Müller's 2-year term in office. As with many other Weimar heads of government, however, the impulses came primarily from outside rather than from the chancellors themselves. The first major crisis was the so-called armored cruiser question in the Reichstag. The Navy's demand for new armored cruisers was a major issue in the 1928 election campaign. As listeners of my podcast may know, the core of the Reichsmarine consisted of outdated pre-dreadnought battleships of the Braunschweig and Deutschland classes. The Treaty of Versailles allowed Germany to operate 6 capital ships with a maximum displacement of 10,000 tons. The Navy therefore developed an armored cruiser that combined the speed of a cruiser with the firepower of a battleship. This concept evolved into the Deutschland-class armored cruisers, the Deutschland, the Admiral Scheer, and the Admiral Graf Spee, which were later called pocket battleships by the Allies. They were designed to be so heavily armed that they could defeat anything they couldn't run away from, and they were designed to run away from anything they couldn't defeat. The combination of cruiser speed and 28-centimeter battleship guns made this possible. However, the SPD had taken a position against the construction of these ships during the election campaign, with the slogan "Food for Children" instead of armored cruisers. Only the Communist Party of Germany KPD shared this view. The center and right-wing parties were for the construction of the armored cruisers, as was Reich President Hindenburg. The construction of the ships was a bitter pill for the SPD to swallow. The cabinet approved the construction of the ships. The disgruntled SPD faction then submitted a motion to the Reichstag to halt the construction of the ships. Through party discipline, the SPD ministers and Chancellor Müller were forced to vote against their own cabinet decision. The SPD motion failed, and the cruisers were built. All the SPD faction had achieved was to publicly tarnish its own government members. The Communist Party, of course, gleefully exploited this event. In September 1928, Müller traveled to a League of Nations conference in Geneva in place of the ill DVP Foreign Minister Gustav Stresemann. There he engaged in a heated debate with French Foreign Minister Aristide Briand, but achieved concrete successes for Germany. Quote from the Reich Chancellor's book, page 104. With a sensational speech, which, with little diplomatic euphemism, identified the shortcomings of post-war European understanding, Müller secured a commitment to negotiations on the early withdrawal of the Rhineland by the French and a final settlement of the reparations issue. In mid-1929 and early 1930, the French then agreed to withdraw from the Rhineland, which was completed on June 30, 1930. This was a significant foreign and security policy success. By the spring of 1929, the coalition negotiations between the parties were concluded, and the shaky cabinet of personalities now had a solid parliamentary majority behind it. For the first time since 1920, Germany had a government that wasn't a minority cabinet. However, there were still points of contention: the budget, the reparations negotiations, and unemployment insurance. In addition, Reich President Hindenburg repeatedly intervened with crossfire. However, the presidentially governing Hermann Müller managed these challenges surprisingly well. The reparations issue was one that once again challenged the government and the country. From February to June 1929, a conference chaired by the American Owen D. Young met in Paris to finally settle the reparations issue. This had not been addressed in the Treaty of Versailles. The Dawes Plan, adopted in 1924, was a first step. This plan established annual payments of 2.5 billion gold marks. However, it was only a provisional plan with crucial weaknesses. 1. There was no end date for the payments. 2. The Reichsbahn and Reichsbank were now subject to international control. 3. It was foreseeable that Germany would not be able to meet these payments in the long term, as they were primarily covered by foreign investments and loans. Most of these loans came from the USA. The Young Plan was intended to transform this provisional arrangement into a permanent settlement. The Young Plan therefore established the following key points. 1. A total payment of 112 billion Reichsmarks. 2. These payments were to be paid in installments of between 1.7 and 2.1 billion per year until 1988. Based on the 1930 figures, Germany would have to cede a good 7% of its revenues and 2.5% of its net national product per year to the victorious powers of the First World War. The political right in the country, especially the DNVP and the Nazi party NSDAP, protested against this plan. The prospect of having to pay reparations for almost 60 years was not a pleasant one for the governing parties either. But the plan was better than the previous Dawes settlement. The DNVP and the NSDAP sought a referendum against the Young Plan. In the vote on December 22, 1929, 94.5% voted against the Young Plan. But only 15% of eligible voters had actually voted. The opponents boycotted the election, thus invalidating it. In March 1930, the plan was finally adopted by the Reichstag by a vote of 270 to 192. One positive aspect of the Young Plan was that it gave the Allies the feeling that they no longer needed to maintain the occupation of the Rhineland. The Reichstag's adoption of the Young Plan was therefore crucial in ensuring that the Allies ended the occupation of the Rhineland in June 1930. However, economic reality quickly thwarted the Young Plan. On October 25, 1929, the Great Depression began with the Black Friday at the New York Stock Exchange. The USA withdrew its loans from Germany, leading to an economic collapse and mass unemployment. It was therefore foreseeable that Germany would not be able to meet the Young Plan payments in the long run. Another detrimental event for the government was the death of DVP leader and Foreign Minister Gustav Stresemann on October 3, 1929. The DVP subsequently drifted sharply to the right. Hermann Müller's health was also not good. In August 1929, he became seriously ill with gallbladder issues. Doctors advised him to withdraw from politics and take it easy, but in view of the numerous crises, he refused. On page 106 of the Chancellor's book, he is quoted as saying, "If I leave, the entire edifice of the Republic will collapse." It continues, "This was not a case of overestimation, but a premonition that would become tragic reality within a year." The adoption of the Young Plan was the last success of the Müller government. On page 105 of the Chancellor's book it states, "Despite Hermann Müller's willingness to compromise, the centrifugal forces within his cabinet could no longer be contained. The government finally collapsed on March 27, 1930, primarily over the issue of increasing unemployment insurance contributions by 0.25%. The SPD parliamentary group was no longer willing to support the negotiated compromise and, in an act of unsurpassed tactical clumsiness, allowed itself to be blamed for the failure of the Grand Coalition, while Reich President Hindenburg and his advisors had already been sounding out suitable individuals and constellations for a government without Social Democrats for months." Hermann Müller was replaced by a significantly more right-wing minority government under the Center Party politician Heinrich Brüning. Brüning attempted to push through measures against the will of the Reichstag by issuing emergency decrees. These included massive austerity measures. When the Reichstag voted to repeal these emergency decrees, Brüning dissolved the Reichstag and called new elections. However, these ended disastrously for both the SPD and the parties that supported the Brüning government. Although the SPD remained the strongest party with 24.5%, its share had shrunk significantly. The right-wing conservative DNVP suffered equally heavy losses, plummeting to just 7%. President Hindenburg's camp had hoped for significantly higher results in this area. The liberal center around the DDP and DVP shrank, and only the Center Party managed to maintain its position somewhat. The big winners in the election were the left-wing extremist KPD and the right-wing extremist NSDAP. After his fall from power, Hermann Müller withdrew for 4 weeks to recover. His health had suffered greatly from his government duties. Moreover, the crossfire from his own SPD, which had sometimes behaved like an opposition party even in government, particularly on the issues of armored cruisers and unemployment insurance, had not exactly helped. Upon his return, he resumed his leadership of the SPD parliamentary group in the Reichstag. Following the 1930 election results, he prepared the SPD for the need to support and tolerate Chancellor Heinrich Brüning to protect the Republic. In the Reichstag, he accused the NSDAP of provoking civil war and national catastrophe with its policies. At the beginning of March 1931, his gallbladder disease returned. At the same time, he contracted severe pneumonia. His health collapsed and he died on March 20, 1931, at the age of just 54. On March 21, 1931, Reichstag President Paul Löbe and Reich Chancellor Heinrich Brüning addressed the Reichstag on the death of the former Chancellor. A portion of Brüning's obituary is quoted on page 148 of the Reich Chancellor's book. "The German people have lost one of their finest. As a human being, he was an impeccable, honorable character, conscientious and reliable, respected even by his political opponents, and as a politician and statesman, he became a center of attention at a very young age. He held a leading position in the most difficult moments of German history. Hermann Müller will live on in grateful memory in our hearts and in the hearts of our people." Hermann Müller's funeral was the last large-scale democratic Republican rally in Germany. President Hindenburg had rejected a state funeral, but the SPD organized a funeral procession of 50,000 participants. 350,000 Berliners watched the funeral from the sidewalks. For Müller's wife Gottliebe, who had remained in the background during her husband's tenure and was not a first lady in the modern sense, the death of her husband was a severe blow. However, the family was hit even harder by the Nazi seizure of power in early 1933. Gottliebe's widow's pension was immediately revoked. The eldest daughter Annemarie was considered half Jewish under the Nazi Nuremberg race laws, which I discuss in episode 40. As a result, she lost her dental license and thus her position as a school dentist. She barely survived with a private practice. She was not allowed to marry her fiancé and was repeatedly harassed by the Nazi authorities. Her half-sister Erika married a Jewish journalist in 1931. In 1933, she was dismissed under the Nazis' professional civil service law. She had previously worked at the district court in Bernau. She emigrated to France. However, after the fall of France in 1940, she was forced to flee. Under adventurous circumstances, she managed to escape to the USA in 1941. From 1944 onward, she worked at a girls' school in Lenox, Massachusetts. In the autumn of 1944, Gottliebe Müller died in Silesia. After the war, Erika remained in the United States and worked there as a teacher until 1976. She died in October 1989. Her half-sister Annemarie returned to work as a school dentist after the war. She died in West Berlin in 1984. Both of Hermann Müller's daughters received compensation payments from the Federal Republic of Germany. They remained childless. Hermann Müller's family was not harassed quite as severely as that of his predecessor, Philipp Scheidemann. Nevertheless, the Nazis' collective punishment mentality made itself felt in the lives of Hermann Müller's two daughters and his widow. A few finishing words. Hermann Müller and many other chancellors of the Weimar Republic and the German Empire are united by the fact that they have been more or less forgotten. There is a Reichskanzler Müller Street in Mannheim, but that's all. There are hardly any memorials, hardly any commemorations, and hardly any books about most of the chancellors. Sure, we know the first chancellor of the German Empire, Otto von Bismarck. Some may also know Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg and the last imperial chancellor, Prince Max von Baden. Perhaps Prince von Bülow is also familiar to some. Of the Weimar chancellors, we may still remember the first, Philipp Scheidemann. After all, he proclaimed the Republic. And the last three, Brüning, Papen and Schleicher, may also be known, but really only as forerunners of Adolf Hitler. Ultimately, however, most of the Reichschancellors have been forgotten, and even those who are somewhat well known are more like faceless shadows than well-rounded personalities in Germany's collective memory. But German history is more than just the Third Reich, and the Weimar Republic is more than just Hitler's precursor. With these episodes about the Weimar chancellors and eventually about other politicians of the Weimar Republic and then also the chancellors of the German Empire, I would like to make a small contribution to rescuing these historical figures from oblivion. Thank you. This was History Lost in Time.